On a Tuesday morning in early November, a man named Darnell cooked a pot of white bean soup on his day off. He did not do it because anyone was watching. He did not do it because someone asked him to. He did it because his mother had done the same thing every first Tuesday of the month for 31 years. Right up until the day she could no longer stand at a stove, and Darnell had promised her he would keep it going. He made the soup, poured it into two large aluminum pots, loaded them into the back of his 12-year-old Chevy Impala, and drove 14 blocks east to the concrete overhang behind the bus station where the same 16 or 20 people gathered every week waiting for something warm. He was 38 years old. He worked the morning prep shift at a mid-range restaurant called Greystone Grill, where he had been employed for 7 years. He earned $16.40 an hour. He had 2 kids at home, a stack of medical bills on the kitchen counter that leaned against the backsplash like they owned the place, and a car with a slow leak in the rear left tire that he topped off every Sunday before church. He fed people because it was right. That was the whole of it. He had no idea who was watching. The bus station was 3 blocks from Greystone Grill. That fact mattered less than it seemed at the time. Darnell had chosen the spot years ago because of the overhang and because the city's shelter ran full most nights, and the people who slept there needed a place to receive something without having to walk very far. He had never thought much about the proximity to his employer. He was not the kind of man who thought strategically about those things. He was the kind of man who thought about whether the soup had enough salt. Each Tuesday he made variations on the same handful of recipes his mother had rotated through by season. White bean with smoked turkey in the fall and winter, collard green and sweet potato in the cold months, black-eyed pea with a ham hock when he could find a good one at the market, chicken and dumplings in January when the temperature dropped and people standing outside needed something dense enough to last them. He had been doing this for 11 years. He had missed 4 Tuesdays in that time. Once when his daughter was born, once when his son was born, once when he had a fever of 103, and once when his mother had her first stroke and he sat in the hospital through the night and did not sleep. The following Tuesday, 2 days after she came home, he made the soup anyway because she would have wanted him to, and because he thought it might help her to know it was still going. She died 14 months later. The soup continued. On this particular Tuesday, a woman named Sylvia was seated in a car across the street from the bus station. She was 62 years old, and she was the owner and founder of a regional restaurant group called Hartwell Hospitality, which operated 11 dining concepts across 3 states. She had built the first one from a single lease and a kitchen her brother helped her finish 28 years ago, starting with lunch service only because she could not yet afford to staff a dinner shift. She had expanded methodically, without debt she could not carry, and the result was not celebrity but a steady, rooted kind of success. Full rooms, honest margins, a staff with tenure, and a name in the regional industry that had accumulated genuine meaning over 30 years of consistent work. She had been parked across from the bus station for 20 minutes, waiting for her daughter's physical therapy appointment to finish in the building behind her. She was reading through vendor invoices on a tablet. She happened to look up. She watched Darnell lift the first pot from his trunk. She watched him carry it carefully, the way a person carries something heavy and hot, with his forearms tensed and his back straight and his eyes on the sidewalk ahead. She watched him set it down on a folding table that appeared to already be there, as if this had happened enough times that the table had learned to expect him. She watched the people come forward, and she watched how he met them. If you have ever seen a man feed people who are truly hungry, not with performance and not with condescension, but with the calm efficiency of someone doing a thing that needed doing, you know exactly what Sylvia saw. Darnell moved without rushing. He listened when people spoke to him. He handed out paper cups and plastic spoons from a bag he had brought from home. He said names, not loudly, not with any announcement, but the way you say a person's name when you have been saying it long enough that it costs nothing and means something. She sat in that car for 40 minutes. Her daughter came out of the clinic and got in, and Sylvia did not immediately put the car in drive. Her daughter followed her mother's gaze across the street. "Who is that?" her daughter asked. "I don't know yet," Sylvia said. She would find out, not that day and not on purpose. The world sometimes arranges the next step without being asked, and this was one of those times. Darnell went to work the following Thursday morning the same way he had gone to work every Thursday morning for 7 years. He arrived at 5:45, clocked in, put on his apron, and began breaking down the walk-in to prep for the breakfast service. He liked that hour of the morning. The kitchen was his alone, and the work was simple and physical, and he could think while his hands moved. He had been thinking about whether the winter soup rotation needed a new addition. He had a recipe for a red lentil stew with ginger that his wife had been suggesting he try for 2 seasons. He was halfway through his vegetable mise when Preston came in at 9 and headed straight for the manager's office. The restaurant's general manager was a man who had been in the position for 8 months, and who Darnell had assessed, in those 8 months, as someone who managed up with great attentiveness and managed down with very little. Preston had views about efficiency, about food cost percentages, about the visual presentation of the kitchen to the corporate visitors who came through twice a year. He had opinions about what the menu should signal to a certain kind of customer. He had, as far as Darnell could tell, no particular opinions about people. At 9:15, Preston called Darnell's name from the office doorway. The tone was not the tone of a man who wanted to discuss a menu revision. The office was small, off the dry storage, with a desk and 2 chairs and a motivational poster on the wall that Darnell had always found quietly irritating, because the people in the kitchen already understood excellence without needing to be reminded by typography. Preston said that a patron had filed a complaint. Darnell asked what the complaint was. Preston said the patron had seen Darnell on his 30-minute break the previous Tuesday, distributing food to homeless individuals at the bus station 3 blocks away, and that the patron felt this reflected poorly on the Greystone Grill brand. Preston said that corporate had been notified and that corporate shared the patron's concern. Darnell was quiet for a moment. He said he had been on his break. He said the food he had distributed was not Greystone food, that he had made it at home on his own time with his own ingredients using his own pots, which he had driven to the location in his own car. He said he had been doing this same thing, at the same location, on the same day of the month, for 11 years. Preston said that perception was the issue. He said a restaurant employee associated with that kind of activity in such visible proximity to the establishment created a context that ownership was not comfortable with. He used the word brand twice more and the word perception 3 additional times, and with each repetition, Darnell felt 7 years of early mornings and physical work and professional care pressing up against the back of the conversation. Darnell looked at Preston and said, "You are letting me go for feeding people." Preston said he preferred the language of parting ways. Darnell took off his apron. He folded it once, which he didn't need to do, and set it on the desk between them with a deliberateness that Preston probably did not recognize as the culmination of a certain kind of patience. He thanked Preston for 7 years of employment, in a tone that was not sarcastic and that did not require interpretation. Then he walked out through the kitchen and said goodbye to the 2 line cooks who were starting the morning prep. One of them, a young man named Jordan who had worked beside Darnell for 2 years, looked up with an expression that understood something had happened without being told what, and gave a single nod, and Darnell returned it. He drove home. He sat in his car in the driveway for a while. The slow-leak tyre felt softer than it had this morning. He looked at the steering wheel. 7 years was not nothing. 7 years was the school enrollment for both his kids, was the length of his marriage, plus 2, was long enough to know every idiosyncrasy of a kitchen walk-in and every tendency of every burner on every line. It was long enough to have trained 3 cooks who were now leading their own shift elsewhere, and to have adjusted the stock recipe twice because the original base was under-seasoned, and he had been right both times, and the menu had been better for it. 7 years. Set on a desk in a folded apron and a phrase about parting ways. He went inside and told his wife. Kezia was not a quiet woman. She was a woman with strong views and a clear voice and a precise mind, and she had none of the qualities of a person who underreacts to things. She sat at the kitchen table and listened to everything, and when Darnell finished, she looked at him for a long moment across the table. "What are you going to do?" she said. He did not answer right away. "I don't know yet," he said. He meant both parts. He did not know yet. But something was moving. He meant both things. Something was already moving in him. Some current that had been running low and steady for a long time and had just been given an opening. He had spent 7 years cooking in other people's kitchen, under other people's menu, to satisfy other people's brand. He had spent 11 years every first Tuesday of the month cooking exactly what he wanted to cook for exactly the people he wanted to feed, with no one's permission. He knew which one of those things was his. He spent the rest of that day making calls. He called his cousin Marcus, who had worked in commercial real estate for 12 years and who owed Darnell a favour from so long ago that neither of them named it directly anymore. They simply both knew it was there. He called his friend Tara, who operated a catering business out of a commissary kitchen on the west side and who had told Darnell at least 4 times in the past 3 years that he was wasting himself in someone else's prep schedule. He called his brother-in-law Curtis, who was a licensed electrician and who had a standing policy of saying yes to family before asking what was needed. By 7 that evening, Darnell had the shape of something. It was not a finished plan, it was a direction. And direction, he had learned from his mother, was what you started with. The plan arrived by working. The next morning, a Friday, he drove back to the block where Greystone Grill sat. He had not specifically intended to look for anything. He had simply felt compelled to drive somewhere that his body already knew, to sit inside the fact of the thing and figure out what came next. He parked across the street and looked at the block and the buildings and the foot traffic. He sat there long enough to see the morning opening at the restaurant he had just been fired from. Long enough to watch Jordan and the other prep cook arrive and unlock the back and disappear inside. He did not feel bitterness watching them go in. He felt something more neutral and more clarifying than that. He felt the distinct sensation of a door that had closed on something that was no longer quite his. Then he looked at the building directly across the street and one storefront north. It was a former dry cleaner, empty for some time, the sign still mounted from 2 previous businesses ago, the windows soaped white. A handwritten number was taped in the lower right corner of the front glass. He called it from the parking lot. The landlord, a man named George, who answered in 3 rings, said the space had been vacant 11 months. He said most prospects walked away when they heard about the kitchen build-out situation. The previous commercial tenant had roughed in a kitchen but run out of capital before completion, leaving a partially installed hood system, roughed-in gas lines, and permits that had been pulled and were still live. Most people who looked at it saw a problem. George had been waiting 11 months for someone to see it differently. Darnell said he would like to see the space that afternoon. He called Marcus from the parking lot before he drove over. Marcus knew the property the way Marcus seemed to know every commercial property within a meaningful radius of his life, and he told Darnell something worth sitting with. The incomplete build-out was actually an advantage for someone with the right skills and the right contacts, because the permits were pulled and the hood was roughed in and the gas lines were already run. A qualified person who could finish the work themselves would arrive $40,000 and roughly 10 weeks ahead of anyone starting from zero. Darnell had the right skills. He was about to find out if he had the right contacts. He walked through the space that afternoon. 1,400 square feet, a dining room with high ceilings and 2 good windows, and a kitchen that needed 10 days of focused work by someone who knew what they were doing. The bones were right. The light from the street-facing windows was exactly right. Standing in the middle of the empty dining room, looking out at the block, Darnell could see the green awning of Greystone Grill from where he stood. He took the space. The lease was signed 6 days later. Marcus had negotiated a 2-month rent abatement for the build-out period and had identified a small business lender who specialized in food and beverage startups and who, upon reviewing Darnell's employment record, his catering contacts from 12 years of side work, and a set of reference letters that arrived faster than Darnell expected from people he had not known were watching him that carefully, approved a startup loan that covered equipment, opening inventory, initial staffing, and operating reserve for 4 months. The amount made the back of his throat go tight in a way that was half relief and half the specific fear of a person who has borrowed seriously for the first time in their life. Curtis started on the kitchen the following Monday evening. He arrived at 7 after his regular shift, a cooler in one hand and his tools in the other, and he didn't ask what the project was before he started asking what needed doing first. He worked every weekday evening from 7 until midnight, and both weekend days start to finish. When Darnell told him he would be paid as soon as the business had cash to pay him, Curtis said he would take his first check when Darnell took his first paycheck, and he said it in the way of a man who had already decided and did not need to discuss the decision further. Tara came through on Wednesday of that first week with her linen supplier's contact information, her smallwares distributor, and a health inspector she described as efficient, which proved accurate. The pre-opening inspection happened on a Thursday afternoon, 3.5 weeks after Darnell had signed the lease, and the inspector signed off without ceremony. 12 days after the lease was signed, the awning went up. Darnell had decided on the name without much deliberation. It had arrived as soon as he asked himself the question, which meant it was not a decision so much as a recognition. He named the restaurant after his mother, whose name was Ruth. and he ordered the sign hand-lettered in warm cream on dark green, the same green as the winter collards she had grown in containers on the back porch when he was a child, and which she gave away in bundles to the neighbours whether the neighbours had asked for them or not. The sign read, "Ruth's Table." No subtitle, no flourish, just the name and the implication. He stood on the sidewalk the morning it went up and looked at it until the looking became real. Then he went inside and put on his apron and started the prep for the first lunch service. Greystone Grill opened at 11. Ruth's Table opened at 10:30. The first week was not a triumph. It was something better than that. It was real, which is what things are before they become what they are supposed to be. The customers in the first week came through a combination of Tara's network and Marcus's contacts, and a quiet form of community word of mouth that Darnell had not organised or anticipated. He had not told anyone publicly why he had left Greystone. He had not posted anything, made any statement, or mentioned the restaurant across the street in any context. The people who came did not come because of a narrative. They came because Tara had told someone who told someone, and because Marcus had mentioned it to people who trusted his judgment, and because the smell coming from Ruth's Table on that first Tuesday at 10:25 was the smell of food cooked by someone who understood what food was for. The first week had its honest difficulties. The ticket printer ran slower than it should, and Darnell fixed it himself on Wednesday evening after close. He ran out of cornbread on Thursday because he had underestimated the demand by a third, and he apologised to every table that wanted it and wrote the correct batch number in his notebook and did not underestimate again. On Friday he stayed until 11, and when he locked the door and walked to his car, he stood on the sidewalk for a moment and looked at the front of the building, the green awning and the dark windows and his mother's name in cream letters catching the light from the street lamp, and he held the week in his mind like something he was still learning the weight of. The menu was 6 lunch items and 8 dinner items, anchored by a rotating daily special and a soup that changed every Tuesday. The Tuesday soup was the one constraint Darnell had imposed on himself before anything else was decided. Whatever the season, whatever the week's ticket volume, whatever was happening with the cash flow, the Tuesday soup was on. The first Tuesday of each month it was the soup his mother had made that month of the year. White bean in November, chicken and dumplings in January, black-eyed pea through the cold stretch. He wrote the specials on a small chalkboard by the register in the same slanted print his mother had used on her recipe cards, which he still kept in a wooden box on the counter at home. By the end of the second week, the Friday evening service had a line that extended past the door. Darnell absorbed this without drama. He adjusted the prep volume, spoke to Bria about the pace she was setting for front-of-house turns, and stayed in the kitchen until 10:30, making sure the last covers left with food that was as careful as the first ones. He went home that Friday night and sat in the kitchen after Kezia and the kids were asleep and tallied the week's numbers in a notebook, and found that he was not yet profitable, but that the gap between what was coming in and what was going out was smaller than it had been 4 days ago and was moving in the right direction. Kezia had said very little about the restaurant's performance in those first weeks. She'd gone back to her job at the medical billing office the Monday after he was fired, leaving earlier and coming home later, and she had not made a production of this. She had simply redistributed what was available and covered the household and gotten the kids to school and picked them up and made dinner on the nights Darnell worked late, which was most of them. The medical bills still leaned against the backsplash. She had arranged a payment plan on 2 of them and was monitoring the third. Imani, who was 11 and observed things with the quiet attentiveness of a person who had grown into someone very precise, asked her father one Sunday morning whether the restaurant was going to be okay. Darnell said yes. She looked at him to determine if he meant it or was performing calm, and apparently decided he meant it because she went back to her cereal without further comment. Devonte, who was 8 and whose primary concern was whether the restaurant would ever serve French fries, had been told it would eventually, and had been satisfied by this. It was on the 3rd Tuesday of December, about 5 weeks after the opening, that Sylvia Hartwell walked in at 11:45. She did not come because she had tracked Darnell down. She came because her daughter had mentioned the Green Awning restaurant 3 times in 2 weeks, which in Sylvia's experience was the number that converted a mention into a visit. She also came because she had made it a professional discipline for 34 years to eat at every new independent restaurant in any neighbourhood where she operated or was considering operating. She sat down at the window table, looked at the short menu with the practiced attention of someone who could read what a menu said about a kitchen, and ordered the white bean soup and a side of cornbread. She spent the first 20 minutes evaluating the room the way she always did. Not critically, but with the particular attentiveness of a person who loves something and notices when other people do it well. The space was small, 18 covers, clean lines and warm light coming from 2 directions. The tables were simple wood. The chalkboard by the register had a Tuesday special written in a slanted hand. She noticed that the cornbread arrived hot without her asking, which meant someone in the kitchen was tracking timing, and she noticed that the young woman who served her, Bria, moved the room at a pace that was unhurried, but never still. The soup was, in Sylvia's assessment, as good as any soup she had eaten in a restaurant in 4 years. That was not a small thing to say, and she said it to herself without qualification. Then Darnell came through the kitchen pass to set a bread basket on a nearby table, and Sylvia looked up and she placed him. It took her a moment to be certain. She had seen him from a car window across a street on a grey November morning, but the way he moved through the room was the same. The quality of attention was the same. She watched him speak to a customer at the corner table, and she watched him check in with Bria without breaking her rhythm, and she watched him look at a plate that was heading out and make a small adjustment to the garnish with one finger before nodding the server through. She asked Bria, when she came to check on the soup, who the man in the back was. Bria said that was the owner. Bria said his name was Darnell. She said she had been with him since the first week because she had been his waitress at his previous restaurant, and he had called her the day he signed the lease. She said it with the matter-of-factness of someone describing a decision that had not required deliberation. Sylvia finished her soup. She sat for a moment with the empty bowl and the warm room. Then she asked Bria if the owner had a few minutes. Darnell came out and sat across from her, and she introduced herself, and she told him where she had seen him before, and she asked him plainly whether this was what he had built because of it. She asked the question the way someone asks when they already suspect the answer and want to understand the person through the telling. Darnell told her the whole thing. He was not dramatic about it. He told her about the Tuesday soup and his mother and the 11 years at the bus station. He told her about Preston and the patron's complaint and the apron folded on the desk. He told her about Marcus and the lease, and Curtis working evenings and the inspection on a Thursday. He told her about the name above the door. He told it the way he cooked, plainly, without decoration, and because of that, it landed with all its actual weight. Sylvia was quiet for a moment when he finished. "You opened in 12 days, she said. "The inspection was on a Thursday," Darnell said. "If it had been Wednesday, I would have opened in 11. She looked at him. "I built my first restaurant from a lease and my brother's nights and weekends. It took me 6 weeks. Darnell said, "Your brother must have had a day job." Something shifted in her expression. She had been studying him the way she studied a room, and she had, in the space of the past several minutes, arrived at a conclusion. She told him she had been looking for a 12th location for 3 years. She told him she had been looking specifically for a chef-operator who could produce what this room produced. A space where the food was honest and the hospitality was genuine, and the customers had the look of people who intended to come back and would tell someone else to. She told him she had a proposal for him to consider. She said it was not a buyout. She said it was not a franchise arrangement, and Ruth's Table would not become a concept or a sub-brand. She said the word partnership, and she meant it, simply and literally. Capital and infrastructure and her network in exchange for a minority stake that left Darnell with full operational control of the kitchen, the menu, and the character of the room. She slid a card across the table, dark green lettering on cream card stock. Darnell looked at it. The name said, Sylvia Hartwell, Hartwell Hospitality. He had heard of it. Anyone who worked seriously in the regional restaurant business for 7 years had heard of Hartwell Hospitality. He told her he would need to think about it and speak with his wife. She said, of course. She said she was in town through the end of the week. She stood and put on her coat, and she paused at the door and looked back at the room one more time. The small warm room with the chalkboard and the Tuesday soup, and Bria moving between the covers with that particular unhurried pace. And she said, "Your mother's name was a good choice." Darnell said, "She would have fed you without charging." "I know," Sylvia said. "That's what I'm counting on." Think for a moment about what it takes to build something in 12 days, to sign a lease when the bills are stacked on the counter and your wife has gone back to work to cover the gap. If you have ever done the right thing when it cost you, when no one applauded and you did it anyway, leave a comment below. This story is for you. The conversation with Kezia that evening lasted 3 hours. They sat at the kitchen table after the kids were down, and Darnell laid out everything Sylvia had said and what he understood the proposal to mean, and Kezia read the terms that Sylvia had emailed over while they talked. Kezia asked questions, careful ones, about the minority stake percentage and what operational control meant in practice, and what happened to the name and the Tuesday Soup in a partnership structure. She was not worried in a way that was emotional. She was thorough in the way of a person who manages medical billing for a living and who has been reading contracts since before the marriage. At 1 a.m, Kezia put down the papers. She looked across the table at her husband, who was looking at the card. She said, "She sat in that car for 40 minutes and watched you feed people before she ever introduced herself. That's what she's actually investing in. Not the menu, not the square footage." Darnell said, "You think we should do it?" Kezia said, "I think you already know what I think." He called Sylvia on Friday morning. He said yes, with 3 conditions. He wanted the Tuesday Soup to remain on the menu at a price point accessible to anyone who walked in off the street, with no markup for margin. He wanted the name above the door to stay as his mother had given it. And he wanted a clause that permitted him to continue his first Tuesday distribution at the bus station, using restaurant resources, without restriction, as long as the partnership lasted. Sylvia said yes to all 3 without any counter. The partnership closed in January. The restaurant closed for 3 weeks in February for an expansion build-out that added a back room and brought capacity to 42 covers. It reopened in March with a piece in the city's dining section, written by a food writer who had heard the story through 3 layers of word of mouth and who led with what had happened at Greystone and described Ruth's Table as the kind of restaurant that reminded you why the form mattered. Darnell read the piece early on a Thursday morning before the prep started. He read it once and set it down on the counter and went into the walk-in to check his produce order. Greystone Grill did not close. Darnell had not wanted it to close. He had not wanted Preston to lose his position or the line cooks to lose their shifts or the kitchen to go dark. He had only wanted the thing that had been decided that morning in the small office off the dry storage to turn out to have been wrong, and the most honest argument for that was a full room across the street. He never talked about what had happened publicly. He never named Preston in any interview or mentioned the firing in any profile. When a writer from a food website asked him directly in April whether the firing had been the catalyst, he said that he had been ready for a long time and the circumstance had made the readiness visible. That was the truth. He had been carrying the knowledge of what he could do for a long time without an occasion to lay it down and see its shape. By summer, Thursday and Friday evenings had a wait list. By fall, Hartwell Hospitality had announced a second Ruth's Table location in a neighbouring city, with Darnell as executive chef and culinary director across both properties. The announcement ran in the trade press and generated the kind of attention that Darnell received with the same equanimity with which he had received the early empty tables and the slow first Mondays. The medical bills on the kitchen counter were paid in full in August. Kezia had removed the last one and stood at the counter for a moment before taking it to the recycling. Then she printed the zero balance statement, put it in a dollar store frame, and hung it in the hallway. Darnell left it there. It was, he thought, the most honest piece of art in the house. Imani asked why they were framing a bill. Darnell told her it was a reminder that some things that look like they are closing you in are actually setting you free. She was 11, and she looked at him with the expression of someone who would understand this fully in about 7 years, and was beginning to understand it now. The first Tuesday Soup continued on the same schedule it always had. Darnell made it in the restaurant kitchen now, in larger volume, and he drove 14 blocks east every first Tuesday and set up at the concrete overhang behind the bus station. A second person from the restaurant had started coming with him in September, after 3 members of staff had asked if they could join, and he had said yes. He also brought bread now, which he baked on Monday evenings after the dinner close. The 2 aluminum pots from his Impala had become 4. The folding table was the same one. He did not think of any of this as charity. He thought of it the way he had always thought of it, as the Tuesday thing, which was a name his mother had given to something that did not need a different one. A woman named Mrs. Gaines had been coming to the Tuesday service for 4 years. She was 71 and had a blue raincoat she wore in all weather, and she always brought a small container of something she had made herself, crackers or cut fruit or sometimes a boiled egg, and she left it on the table beside the pots the way a person leaves an offering they are not making a show of. Darnell had never commented on it, and she had never explained it, and the arrangement between them was one of the finest things in his week. He thought about her sometimes when he was writing the Tuesday special on the chalkboard, whether the soup that month was one she would like, whether the bread was soft enough for her. One evening in October, close to a year from the morning Preston had said the word perception for the 6th time in a small office, Darnell was at the bus station finishing the service when a man named Earl came through the group and stopped in front of him. Earl was one of the regulars, a thin man with careful eyes who had been coming since before the restaurant existed, who always took his cup at the end of the line and always stood slightly apart from the group. Over the past year, Earl had found a room in a transitional housing facility 2 miles from the bus station and a part-time position at a laundry service on the east side. He came to the Tuesday service still, not always for the soup, but because the Tuesday service was a place where he had been called by his name for 11 years, and some places became part of what you are. Earl said, "I heard about the restaurant," Darnell said. "I hope you heard good things," Earl said. "I heard you opened in 12 days, Darnell said. "The inspection was on a Thursday. If it had been a Wednesday, it would have been 11. Earl was quiet for a moment. He looked at the green awning visible down the block, 3 buildings east, the cream lettering catching the last of the evening light before the street lamps came on. Then he looked at Darnell and said, "I'm glad they fired you." Darnell laughed. It was a laugh that came from somewhere free of anything complicated, and the freedom of it was its own information. He handed Earl his cup. The soup was white bean. The bread was still warm from the morning bake. Some things do not need to be said aloud to be understood. Darnell's mother had known that. She had never explained the Tuesday soups to anyone, had never felt the need to, because the acts themselves were the explanation. What you do faithfully when no one appears to be watching is the truest account of who you are. The world keeps that ledger, carefully and over time, even when you do not. That first Tuesday of November, a year after a patron had made a phone call and a manager had chosen what perception meant over what was right, Darnell stood in the early dark at the concrete overhang and watched 19 people receive something warm and freely given. The number was 3 more than last year. He noted it without fanfare. He packed the empty pots into the trunk of his car at dusk. Earl raised a hand from across the lot. Darnell raised one back. He drove west into the last of the evening light, and the city moved around him, and Ruth's table sat warm and lit 3 blocks behind him, and Darnell drove home with the quiet feeling of a man who had built something that was going to outlast the thing that tried to stop it. If this story moved you, tell us in the comments what it brought to mind. Have you ever done the right thing when it cost you something? And if you want another story about someone who refused to let what was taken from them be the end of the story, stay close. There is another one coming. This story is a work of fiction inspired by real themes of dignity, perseverance, and community. Any resemblance to actual persons or events is coincidental.